we have something called the Neurodevelopmental Pathway, or the NDP, which is a large team sitting in Cannes. It includes mostly clinical psychologists. There's also a psychiatrist, there's a paediatrician, and that's me. There's a family therapist, a speech therapist, and an occupational therapist. And the way the team works in this pathway, each child is assigned a case coordinator who works alongside some support clinicians in doing the assessment. The case coordinator organises a first informal meeting with the family and the child to kind of get to know them, and then there's a more formal and much longer clinic appointment to do the ADOS assessment, a child observation, a child assessment, and a detailed parent history. So those are our two services, and I'm going to talk about remote assessments in autism in general and what kind of tools are already available for us to use, but I also want to the experience of using these tools and what we have done in Islington in response to the pandemic. Before I do it, I thought it would be useful just to kind of go over the principles of an autism assessment. What does it actually involve? What should it involve? Of course, we've got NICE guidance to help us here, and this is a screenshot of the autism NICE guideline, and it says that in every autism diagnostic assessment, you should take a history from that, you should take a developmental history, a medical history, do a physical examination, and it includes some discussion about the assessment of the child, which does need to involve observation of the child. So that can guide us in terms of what we need to do for an autism assessment. And essentially, the process of diagnosing autism is all about information gathering. We want to find out as much information as possible to find out whether we can, whether a child meets the criteria for a diagnosis of autism using the DS criteria. Now, of course, there are a lot of gold standard tools out there, like the ADOS, like the ADI, the 3DI. They're all kind of validated tools which we can use to edit, but it's important to be aware that they're neither essential nor mandatory in our assessment. And I've just included here the DSM-5 criteria. These are the sheets that we sort of tick off whether or not we feel a child has met these criteria. So now moving on to talking about telehealth in autism in general. It's not a new science, it's been around for some time. Most of the research thinking about tools for remote assessment in autism has come from the United States. And interesting enough, the research has been driven by pandemics, but it's been driven more about increasing accessibility to autism services. So one of the groups that has looked into this is Zachary Warren's group at the Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, which is in Tennessee, which I think is quite a large state. And they note that there are some families who live in remote parts of Tennessee that would have to spend 3 or 4 hours traveling just to get to their most local autism diagnostic assessment center. And so for this reason, they have developed tools that enable these families to be seen locally or to be seen in their own room. Kathy Lord, who is the person who designed and published the ADOS assessment tool, she's based at UCLA, and she has brought out something called the BOSC and the BOSA, which we'll talk about. And there are other assessment tools out there. So one of them is and much of the research has looked at, the validity of using a remote assessment as your approach to diagnosis. It's shown that the sensitivity of such approaches is around 80%. So most studies have shown 78% in this case. I think it was evaluating the Vanderbilt level, which is pretty good. So it's kind of suggesting that most of the cases of autism are picked up and there are very few false negatives. So it's both feasible and valid to use a remote assessment tool to diagnose autism. So let's talk about the different tools that are available. Well, one that has been used by all, widely known, is something called the Vanderbilt Tele-ASD PEDS. We call it the Vanderbilt, it's much easier to say. It's quite a nice, neat little tool. It's a short tool. It's intended for children aged 2 to 3, and these are children who have not yet developed French speech. Designed to be led by parents at home with a video observation by clinicians. I think essentially those activities which we use in the ADOS and other validation assessment tools. So they're activities that are very familiar to us as clinicians, and they include the child playing with toys, the child playing with toys with the parent directing them, the child responding to social bids when the parent calls their name, when the parent directs their attention to something. There are some requesting activities, requesting bubbles, asking for help to open a difficult to open container for a snack, some ready, steady, go play with buzz and balloons, and some social physical play like chasing and tickling games. So that's the Vanderbilt. And the advantage is that they, on their website, have made many of their guidelines and tools and resources freely available. So this is the administration guidelines. It essentially says these are the things that we're going to do, and it tells the parent what to do and what to say. So there we are. Those are all the guidelines. And then they also include this as a rating form. So when you're looking at and observing a child, you can rate what you see, and that's also very helpful. So that's the Vanderbilt. Moving on to thinking about the BOSC and the Kathy Lord's team at UCLA. So this is another team that's done a lot of research in this area. And Kathy Lord, as I said, is the person who invented the ADOS. So she's highly respected. She's given some very recent webinars which have been accessed internationally. So my team, we all watched this webinar, which was a few weeks ago, and there was a follow-up webinar last night, in fact. And she talks about how it's really important to bear in mind that autism assessment, however you do it, needs skills observation. We shouldn't lose sight of that fact. However, she also says that it's okay if the assessment is simply adequate. It just needs to be. And she also says that diagnostic tools are not the final words. They are merely tools providing useful information. So she kind of reinforces this idea that actually it's only about gathering information to make a diagnosis. She's very clear about ADOS using a face mask. An ADOS with video or on video remotely is not an ADOS. You cannot technically describe it as an ADOS. You can't use the ADOS algorithms and score sheets to score a child doing an ADOS in these ways. However, she says, of course, you can use information that you do gather from an adapted ADOS, and you can use it in a descriptive way for it. And so the tool that she has published is this one called the BOSC, the Brief Observation of Social Communication. This has been, I think, been around for some time. It's been superseded by another one called the BOSA, the Symptoms of Autism. And this is the one that she now intends for general use by clinicians in the coronavirus pandemic. So I think it's very similar to the BOSC, but it's the one that is being published and is going to be made freely available. But I think as far as I can tell, they're fairly similar. The BOSA is very new. I haven't seen it yet. We're all in our team going to receive some training about it and to decide whether it's something that we could use. It is brief. It's 12 to 14 minutes. Again, it's parent-led, and it can be done in the parent home, the child's home. There are 3 versions which neatly map onto the different modules within the ADOS. So it's kind of very well aligned with the ADOS. There is a version for the minimally verbal child, a version for children who have speech, and a version for children with fluent speech, and also one for older children and adults. So that aligns with the 4 different modules in ADOS, and they're basically conversational tasks carried out by the parents with the clinician observing. I mentioned NODA is just one of the other tools I think has been around for quite a long time. It's a naturalistic observational diagnostic assessment. It's not an assessment tool in the same way that the others are. I think it's an app that supports parents to capture behaviour on their mobile phones, which will then be useful in determining whether a child meets the criteria for a diagnosis of autism. So those are the tools that are available. What about our experience? As I said at the beginning, we very quickly had to sort of decide how we were going to conclude all the assessments that we were doing and think outside the box. So we very quickly kind of decided what we were going to do. I'll tell you about the over 5s first of all, mainly because got off to a quick start in the over 5s. I was at the time in the middle of an assessment of a 6-year-old boy who I knew very well. I'd already assessed him for ADHD and given him an ADHD diagnosis, and was going to assess him for autism. And the only thing that I needed to do really to draw any conclusions was the ADOS at this point, and we couldn't conclude when we were kind of poised to conclude. And of course, we were all suddenly experts in using technology, so I immediately thought, well, why don't we try to do some of the ADOS items over video? And so I was about trying to use the ADOS materials. We scanned them, we emailed them to Mum. We also sent up a backup copy by post. I said it's questionable because, of course, there are copyright issues, and I think it's probably illegal, so this isn't something we'll be doing again, but we did in the heat of the moment at that time. And we kind of thought, well, we'll suck it and see. We'll see how it goes. We knew that we might have to wait until a face-to-face assessment became possible if this remote assessment didn't work, weren't able to conclude at the time. So these are some of the parent instructions that we sent out to the mother of this child, together by one of my colleagues. In the green, it's telling the parents what they are going to say, and the blue is what they need to do. And it gives them ideas of what they need to get together at home to do the task. So this is essentially what the ADOS looks like in real life, but it's adapted for use at home. And the yellow lines are where the clinician is going to lead the task. So that's what we put together. And what did we learn? Well, in this case, we were very lucky. We were able to conclude, and we gave a diagnosis to the child. It was really helpful that Mum was so organised. I had a pre-ADOS planning chat with her on the telephone. That really helped. She read the instructions. She had everything she needed. She hadn't at that point used Zoom technology, but she was very happy to try it out. She knew when to engage with her child and when to hold back. So it all went very, very well. However, many of my colleagues were beginning to try something similar with the children they were assessing, and they had slightly less positive experiences. Some families had a language barrier. There was, I think, like I said, that there was a mother who was a single parent, and there were other children in the household that made it very hard for her to engage with the assessment, or the child themselves didn't engage. And so these positive, and we realised then very early on that actually it was important to select children very carefully before doing a remote assessment. We learned that the pre-assessment practice, that it was always helpful to have that chat with the family beforehand. Some cases it was worth having a practice Zoom session with them if they weren't familiar with Zoom. It was also a good idea to have a kind of a pre-assessment family sessions where it's simply just meeting the family on screen just to say hello and for the child to get to know you. We learned that actually having observers was very possible for people to mute themselves and turn their camera off, and that way they could watch while being hidden. We also learned that using the speaker view was a good idea, particularly for the family, so they could hide the observers rather than using a gallery view. So these are the kind of things that we learned were kind of practical issues. There were some other practical issues that were came up in our first session. So there are a couple of tasks in the ADOS that involved the clinician doing some sort of demonstration to the child, and we clearly put our camera in the wrong place, and it wasn't very easy to demonstrate what we needed to demonstrate. So we learned about that for the next time. But then some more important things, or more key important things, was the idea that it's very hard to score and evaluate eye contact on the screen. The usual rules for eye contact are you've got a screen, and what I often say is that I use my iPad for most of my Zoom meetings, my work meetings, and I use it in the kind of the landscape. The camera is at one end, and I notice that whenever I speak on screen that I'm never looking at the camera. So it's very clear that actually you just can't judge eye contact in any kind of helpful way. And this is a real shame because, judging eye contact, integration of eye contact with other communication measures is really key to an autism assessment. And then the final thing that we, felt was a bit of a challenge and a question that came up was, what if we weren't able to reach a conclusion? What would we do then? Was it possible to then say, well, we'll see you when we can do face-to-face appointments and do an ADOS again, or was that a valid approach? You're not supposed to repeat ADOSs within, I think, a year. What would we do then? And this was another question that we were sort of unable to answer. So moving now to the under fives, these are the kind of the three tools or the three modes that we've been trying out. A number of us have been doing different things for different children. What I want to do is just tell you about my experiences of using them in specific children and the kind of things that we learned from those. So the Vanderbilt we have been trialling and using quite a bit. In this case, we used it for a child who was 4 years old, and the whole assessment went really well. Mum was very organised, she had everything, child engaged beautifully, the technology worked, and actually he presented with lots and lots of strengths in the assessment, such that it was really hard to conclude the assessment. And so afterwards, we had a bit of a chat about what had happened and what we could learn from it. And the first thing that was really important learning for us was that he was too old, that he was 4 years old and he had too much speech really for a Vanderbilt. And module 2 from the ADOS would have been a better thing for him. So it's important to think about the child's language level, and that's something we've learned going forward. The second thing we realised was that before we did the video assessment, the picture of this child was actually quite mixed. So we had reasonably supported information from the family, from their history. We had some supportive information from the nursery, but we weren't entirely sure before we did the video assessment how, what the conclusion would be. And we felt that actually maybe it does help to have a clear idea of what you're looking for before a remote assessment. Mum also agreed that she didn't think we had seen a typical snapshot of him on that day. And so our action after this assessment was to get a bit more up-to-date information from the nursery, and also to ask the family to send some videos of this child and the sort of typical behaviour that we see at home. So that was our experience with the Vanderbilt, and we have used it actually a fair amount more since then. So I think we're gathering a bit more experience of using the Vanderbilt. We've also adapted the ADOS module 2. And in this case, we tried it out a child who was 5 months, another child with lots and lots of strengths, a really bright kid with lots of language, often described by his parents and also by the school. Now, to begin with, the mother was a bit unsure about using video assessments. I think she was a bit unsure about whether she felt a good idea to conclude this sort of diagnosis based on a sort of remote view of her child. But she was also a bit worried about having to wait a long time for the possibility of a face-to-face assessment, and also how valid would a face-to-face assessment be if we had to be wearing full PPE. So in the end, we decided we would do the remote. It did go very well. Mum had prepared really well again. She knew all the cues. She sat the child at this lovely white table so we could see everything that was going on. For us, the autistic features were very clear, and we were able to conclude, and we gave the child a diagnosis. And we learned a few things from this. It was fine to give mum instructions during the assessment in front of the child. So, for example, it was fine to say to mum, "Do you think you could do the bubbles again and just wait and wait to see whether he asked for any more?" And it was also okay to ask mum to report whether the child had made eye contact with us, though we couldn't judge it. But it was fine to ask her for her ideas of whether he had looked at her when he was asking. So those are the things we learnt with ADOS. And again, we put together a little kind of instruction sheet which we sent to this family, and we send to our families. It gives you a time to get together. It tells you what to do and what to say. So there we go. Those are the tasks that we've used. And the final thing we've been doing is clinical information by other methods. So in this case, we were assessing another child at the sort of older end of the scale for this particular team, a 5.5-year-old boy, also very verbal, also very bright. And in this case, the parent history was very suggestive of autism. The school history was also very suggestive, and the parents were already very much on board with the diagnosis of autism, and they saw it as a positive thing for their child if he were to get a diagnosis. And there was a strong family history, so they were very prepared to hear their child had autism. And what they had done anyway was to send us videos of what they saw as very typical frequent behaviour from their child. They sent us a video of him running backwards and forwards while sort of in his own world. They sent us videos of him playing, one with his mum and another one with his dad. And it was clear that although he was playing really with toys, there was very little shared enjoyment between him and his parents. At one point, he was sitting with his back to his dad while playing. And then there was another video of him becoming easily when he was frustrated about something small. So we were able to see kind of, how a meltdown looked for him and how this was quite a common thing for him. So all in all, we had a huge amount of information. We felt that the information we'd been given was already sufficient to complete the DSM-5 and that he met the criteria for a diagnosis. And in fact, we fed back to this family last week and they were very assessment and pleased to be able to conclude the assessment. So those are sort of just a summary of some of our experiences and what we've been doing. It was important to kind of put together an overarching pathway for all of our assessments in both teams to guide clinicians in the teams as to whether they should be doing a remote assessment, whether that would be a sensible idea. We sort of go by the principle that it should be remote first if possible, but if not possible, then to plan for a face-to-face assessment. So to begin with, it's always important to have that initial telephone conversation with families, to introduce yourself, to have a discussion about whether they would prefer to conversations over the telephone or via video link, and also to find out if they need an interpreter. And then comes the information gathering stage, where we get the parents' history from the nursery. At that stage of gathering information, we realise that there are three important things that we need to think as to whether we should consider remote assessment. That first of all, if after gathering all the information it seems quite likely the child has autism, then that would be a reason to go ahead for a remote assessment. If the parents are on board with the possibility of autism diagnosis, if they seem ready to hear, then that will be another reason to do a remote assessment. And thirdly, they need to be comfortable with the idea of diagnosing their child remotely and also comfortable using the technology. So those are the sort of three key things that we think are important when selecting children for remote assessment. On the list is also parents do not require an interpreter, which we're trying to do something about. I think at the moment it seems difficult to envisage how we would involve an interpreter with a remote assessment, but I'm sure it's not insurmountable, and it's something we would like to investigate because it feels like it's discriminating against those families who so those are our sort of guidelines, helping clinicians to decide whether or not they feel they can do a remote assessment on the child that they're assessed. And we're, as I said, we're beginning to kind of try lots of different things and beginning to evaluate the kinds of assessments we're doing and what the outcomes of those assessments. So that's all I'm going to say, some references, and I'm very happy to answer any questions. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. I think that's the thing, and I have to figure how I do that. Here we go. There. I think I've stopped sharing now.
You have. That's fabulous. Thank you, Nicole. Does anybody have any questions for Nicole? Either raise your hand or put them in the chat. One thing, can you comment on this, Nicole, from your perspective? When I was hearing Leslie do this presentation, one of the things that she said that really struck me was that she felt that it gave parents it gave them a sort of a more equal standing with the professionals, because they were almost running the process from their side of things. Mm-hmm. Is that how you've found it as well?
Yes, I mean, I think there is something, I think you can look at it both ways. I think there is something positive for families about us being invited into their home and their natural sort of circumstances for us to observe how things are for them at home. Of course, we only ever see a snapshot in the clinic room. It's an artificial situation, and I think parents that really appreciate they've been given a privileged window into their lives at home, and I think they like the fact that we hopefully will see things that they see that otherwise we wouldn't otherwise see. And also, I think you're right that these assessments are by definition are parent-led, and we're the observers in this situation. Something quite helpful about that might draw out some things that as clinicians we wouldn't otherwise draw out. However, the downside of that is that actually sometimes clinicians need to be the drivers a little bit so that we can draw out certain aspects of social communication that we haven't yet seen. So it does help sometimes for the clinicians to be in control, but I think there are clear advantages for parents feeling that the child is in their natural habitat and showing things that the parents see all the time.
That's great. Thanks for that, Nicole. And Claire's got her hand up. Claire, would you like to come in?
Hi, I just wanted to say it's really interesting listening to what you've had to say. I think we're at the stage in Baines and Wiltshire, we're looking at kind of what we do next, and we've done a lot of the kind of the initial bit of the pathway and the information gathering and telephone calls with families and settings. And so our next steps are looking at kind of what virtual assessments we can offer while we're still planning the kind of safe return to face-to-face assessment. So it's really interesting to see that, there's already some services that have already started trialling this. And I suppose I'm just really interested in how services can link up. So there's a bit of kind of consistency around how we're sort of doing these virtual assessments. And I think it's really interesting. There's lots of things happening already. And I'd just be interested to know sort of what people think about how we might have a bit more of a kind of collaborative approach to it, rather than all the areas doing sort of very similar things individually.
And is that...
Yes, I mean, I agree. I think I agree. I think having a collaborative approach would be really, really helpful. And I think something we were talking about with the last session is just about the BOSC and the BOSA, which we're yet to see what the BOSA's like, but it may be that is the way forward for our team and possibly other teams, if it is the most standardized and most validated tool that is available for us that links in with the ADOS. It may be the way forward for many teams.
I think I'm also aware of a couple of academics who I think have either got funding or applying for funding to do things to try and validate the various approaches that people are trying at the moment. So I think the frustrating thing about that especially for people like me who want it solved now, is that obviously that takes time to do properly, so, and it doesn't necessarily help you right here right now. But I think where that will help us is in identifying, it's a bit like what Lorraine was saying in her presentation, is what new things have we been doing that actually we should start to introduce to our practice, not just because of the pandemic, but actually because aspects of them work really well. So I think it will really help when we're starting to make those sort of decisions when we're in more of a recovery situation.
Yeah.
Have we got any other questions for Nicole? Because I've got loads. Lynette is struggling with her connection, so I'll read out her questions. So what are the resource implications of doing this remotely, like prep for family and the time observing? Is it sort of quicker or lengthier than doing it face to face, Nicole, in your experience?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, actually. I think the initial preparation has involved a fair amount of work to produce the parent instruction sheet. But I think now that we've produced them, of course, they may change or may decide to take a different tack. But now that we've produced them, and we've also produced guidelines for our clinicians as to how to approach an assessment, I think it's much more streamlined now. I think actually implications haven't been that great, that actually I think we've spent as much time with families that we would have done in the face-to-face situation. I don't think it's had a huge impact now that things are kind of up and running and people are getting used to doing the kind of protocols that we're using. So I don't think it's had a huge impact, not yet anyway.
Sorry, I know Leslie was saying last time that she was thinking that possibly because at the time obviously we were thinking that we could be with 2 metre distancing for a while, that in terms of sort of maintaining clinic throughput, you wouldn't be able to see the same number of children in a clinic during a day because of cleaning, so that it might help in terms of meaning that you were still able to see the same numbers as you would normally have pre-COVID.
Yeah, I think that is the case. I mean, I just thinking about I was in the previous group that I did my first face-to-face ADOS in PPE this morning. So we did a ADOS clinic and we saw 2 children back to back, and we would normally see 2 children back to back. The difference is that it was a slightly clinic time because we weren't feeding back to the family, which we would normally do in our clinics, and we're using a different time to do that. But I think the throughput now feels like it's very much, I don't have the data, but it feels like it's very much like where we were pre-pandemic. I think at the very first few weeks of the lockdown, we were deciding what we were going to do, and I think we decided, like a lot of teams, to do as much as we could on telephone, and so we were essentially information gathering. But now we're going through all those that need the assessments, so we're managing to do those, and I think we're pretty much getting back to where we were actually. I don't have the data. I think that's that's the feel that we have, is that we're actually working at the same capacity that we were working at before the pandemic.
Oh, super. Thanks, Nicole. And you've got a question from Ali, who's wondering if there is more than one practitioner with the child and parent carer. So do you have many windows with many clinicians, or just one at a time? Does that go back to what you were saying about having the view that you choose?
Yeah. So we, in both teams, we usually have at least one observer. So mostly there's one observer in the ADOS assessments. This is pre-pandemic, and I think that has continued. So there's usually one observer on the screen watching over the video. And the same is true for our face-to-face assessments, so the ones that we did today. There was 2 of us doing the ADOS, one observing, one actually administering the ADOS. Although interestingly, I shared the Islington experiences with the community paediatric group that I'm part of for our CPD, and there was quite a lot of discussion about how actually ADOSs don't have to be done with more than one person, that the actual original design was for one person doing the ADOS while the ADOS was recorded, so that was possibility for other team members to watch the ADOS. So actually it doesn't have to be done necessarily with more than one person, which I thought was interesting. It's something that was new to me. But essentially we usually do have at least 2 people doing the ADOS, one doing it and one observing in our team.
And you've also got the same question we had last time, Nicole, and it might be our last one looking at the time, which is about whether there was resistance from practitioners to this approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Mike was in Islington anyway. We're very, very lucky. So I work across both teams. Both teams are managed by the same person, in fact. So it's essentially functions like one large team. We're all, I said, I'm very lucky that I work with lots and lots of clinicians who are all very, very flexible and very keen to try lots of new things out. So I personally have not experienced any resistance from anybody. I think everybody is very keen to just get on and try things, which I think is something with the Islington team, is that we're very good at just saying, well, why not? Let's have a go. Let's see what happens. Saying earlier that actually, I feel that in both the teams that I work in, like probably almost every team across the country, we've had to be really flexible because of the constantly increasing waiting lists, constantly increasing referral rates, that we're constantly having to rethink what we do, reevaluate what's essential, what's not essential, how can we streamline things. So this is a kind of what we're used to functioning in this way, and this is just a whole other dimension that we've had to cope with, as have all the other teams. So we're very lucky we haven't had any resistance to trying new things. Actually, more of excitement. There's a real feel of buzz and excitement about trying different things within our team.
Oh, that is super. And are you all right for me to share the slides with people, Nicole? That would be great. So thank you so much again for that. We've got 2 minutes left. So Claire has got in under the wire with the last question. So have you carried out face-to-face ADOS with clinicians and child wearing face masks? I think you said you just had, Nicole.
That's correct. So today was my first time doing face-to-face one. We've just started them last week, in fact, but it was my first clinic today. We have set it up so that the person doing the ADOS wears a visor, plastic visor, a plastic mask and gloves. And then the person observing wears a normal surgical mask with gloves, so that they can help to handle some of the items and tidy them away and so on. So that's what we did today. My initial experience was that it went very well. In neither, we saw 2 children, and in neither case did the child seem at least perturbed by a strange woman wearing a funny visor. So they didn't seem to mind that at all. It seemed to go very well. So yes, so far so good, I would say. It's not been, it's kind of weird for the clinician wearing all this gear. It's a very, very strange thing, particularly when, especially if you're wearing a face mask. I think we're so used to communicate by smiling and, sharing our joy at seeing this child, that actually to have your face covered is a very weird thing. But actually, in terms of the administration, it didn't seem to have much of an impact on the ADOS.
Okay, that is brilliant. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nicole, and for giving up your time. I know everybody has really appreciated that, so can't thank you enough. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you everybody for joining in and for asking questions. And as I say, we will share the write-up and also post the recording that we've done. So thank you very much. And it's 4:30. I'm going to let you go. Don't forget to do your evaluation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.